Thank you very much for coming. I am Barb Giffen, and I am the president of the Rutland Historical Society. I welcome you all. I am especially excited to have our presenter, Howard Coffin, here today. He will be here talking about the sharpshooters of Vermont. So we're very excited to have him. We also have a display over there of Civil War items that we have here. Without further ado, Howard.
Thank you. Whoa! Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Jack Crowther told me I'd say that first. Yeah, he's been here before. We worked together at the Rutland Herald a couple weeks ago. Gee, I drove down by the Herald today. I worked there from 66 to 78. And it was during that time I really got serious about Civil War research. I got 1 week's vacation every year, and I would study all winter long on some Civil War battle, and then I'd take my week's vacation in the summer and go down and travel all over that battle and see how it was fought. And so that's how I really got going. So nice to be here. I'm going to get rid of this too. Yes. So, as I began to study Vermont Civil War history, which really had been lost, it wasn't taught at all when I was a kid, I began to become amazed again and again and again at what those Vermonters had done. I heard they were heroes at Gettysburg, but they were really heroes, maybe won the battle. And then I, learned about Cedar Creek, and I learned about Petersburg, where they broke the Confederate lines, and I learned about Wilderness, which I wrote a book about, which I think is their most important battle. And it went on, and it was only 3 or 4 years ago that I learned about what the sharpshooters really did at Gettysburg. And of course, it was after all my books had been written. I'm thinking now of rewriting Full Duty to get a lot of things in that I've learned since that came out. But the sharpshooters is a remarkable story. It's been fun to research, and there hasn't been that much demand for it. I'm not sure why, except we're getting near the 250th of Vermont, and maybe everybody wants to hear about the Revolution now, but good to see there's still some Civil War people around. I'm one of them. Anyway, so a lot to cover today. His name was Hiram Berdan. Are you hearing me okay back there? And he was well familiar with Vermont. He married a woman who came from a place that's about as close to Vermont as you can get without being in Vermont, West Lebanon. Berdan was 38 when the Civil War began, living comfortably in a mansion on Long Island. He was a New Yorker. Already rich and famous, he was a prominent inventor and engineer. Among the things he held patents on, a process for separating gold from ore, which is still used, a collapsible lifeboat, a twin propeller submarine, a repeating firearm known as the Berdan rifle. That last was not surprising because from 1846 to 1861, Berdan was the marksmanship champion of the entire nation, widely known as the best shot in America. When the Civil War began, guess what? He had an idea. At least he said it was his idea. There was some controversy about this. By then he had made powerful friends, so he thought nothing of sending a letter directly to the President of the United States asking Abraham Lincoln that he be authorized, that Berdan be authorized to form a new kind of military unit. He proposed a military outfit, a regiment made up of the finest marksmen in the North. Berdan would find the best of the best shooters and have them operate. His plan was to have them operate well back behind the front lines. As we shall see, he may have had some self-preservation in mind with that plan. The plan was to have the sharpshooters back there behind the lines, picking off at great distance the Confederate officers, maybe some generals. Lincoln liked the idea, and he ran it by the chief of his army, Winfield Scott, old Winfield Scott, and Scott didn't like it at all. Scott said he thought the breech-loading rifles that Berdan thought about would waste ammunition. But Lincoln overruled him and gave the go-ahead to Berdan. He called Berdan's idea both patriotic and original. Berdan was authorized to form not one but 2 regiments of sharpshooters, 1,000 men each, to be named the 1st United States Sharpshooter Regiment and the 2nd United States Sharpshooter Regiment. Berdan would be in overall command with the rank of full colonel. Vermont would provide one of the 10 100-man companies in the 1st Regiment, Company F, 1st U.S. Sharpshooters. Vermont tryouts were held throughout the state, and men flocked to them. I know they took place in Randolph, Woodstock, Bennington, Bethel, and Burlington, and one trial was held in Rutland in September 1861 at the fairgrounds. Harrison and Charles Peck, farm boys from Ira, gave it a try. Harrison remembered, in the morning of the day set for the test, 2 brothers go down from the hills with a horse and buggy. After they're hitching their horse under the meeting house shed in the village, with their rifles saunter down to the fairgrounds, where they find a large crowd of people who have assembled to witness the shooting, which was under the direction and control of William Y.W. Ripley. When the targets were in place and the distance measured, the elder of our 2 boys stepped to the firing line and, carefully loading the rifle, commenced firing. The first shot was a little wild, but inside the ring. So were all the 10 consecutive shots, many of them being almost in the center of the target. The younger of the boys then walked to the line, and although somewhat nervous at first, he succeeded in placing 10 bullets within the ring. As each shot was fired and the target master placed a black patch over the bullet hole, a cheer went up from the crowd. The rules of the trials were the same throughout the North. Each participant brought his own rifle. Each participant got 6 shots taken unsupported from the shoulder, shooting at a target, a 10-inch circle, 200 yards distant. Phew! To qualify, all 10 shots must be in the circle, no second chances. Incidentally, both Peck boys qualified and served in Company F, and both were wounded during the war but came home. The leader of Company F was the above-mentioned William Ripley, a Rutland man who, like his brother Edward, was a born leader. The Ripleys were of a rich and well-known family that owned hotels in New York City and also made a great deal of money in the marble business. William's brother, Edward Hastings Ripley, commanded the 9th Vermont Regiment. Edward later led a brigade in the Army of the James near the end of the war that became the first Union troops to enter the Confederate capital of Richmond. Their sister was the very well-known poet Julia Dorr. William came to the sharpshooters as a lieutenant colonel. He was a crack shot. The family, as you probably know, had an estate in Mendon, right across from the town hall up there. There's a stone up there, you know, by that old sugar house where his horse is buried, you know, his war horse. He probably wandered, as a boy, those hills up there hunting. Ripley wrote, very soon after the outbreak of the war for the Union, it became painfully apparent that the rank and file of the Confederate armies were the superior of their northern antagonists in the use of arms. Recruited mainly from the rural districts, their armies were composed of men who had been trained in the skillful use of the rifle in that most perfect school, the field and forest, in the pursuit of game so abundant in the sparsely settled districts. Unquestionably, the sharpshooter capital of Vermont was Randolph. There lived Homer Stoughton, a railroad executive who apparently had quite a lot of political clout. And it no doubt helped that if you draw straight lines from each of the four corners of Vermont, they cross at Randolph, like the bullseye of a target. Most precisely, the exact center of Vermont is Randolph Center. Company F assembled at West Randolph, which we now know as Randolph, in early September 1861 at the fairgrounds, which is now where the hospital stands. With a full complement of 100 qualified men, the company was mustered into the service on September 12th. Next day, it took a train to New York City and set up camp at Weehawken, New Jersey, across the Hudson. Most men had their own rifles, though they were promised new ones in the future. While at Weehawken, the sharpshooter camp became a popular attraction, and the men daily put on a shooting exhibition before large crowds. On September 24th, the whole regiment left by train for Washington. A new encampment called the Camp of Instruction was set up on the north side of the city. Colonel Ripley said many of the men had brought with them their own rifles, and target shooting became a pastime, and many matches between individuals and companies were made. Great improvement was noted in marksmanship. On one occasion, President Lincoln, accompanied by General McClellan, paid a visit to the camp and asked to be allowed to witness some of the sharpshooting of which he had heard so much. A detail of the best men was made, and the display of skill took place, which perhaps was never before equaled. President Lincoln himself, as did General McClellan, took part in the firing. The president using a rifle belonging to Corporal Harrison Peck of the Vermont Company. Peck was from Ira. Nobody that I can find wrote down anything about how well Lincoln could shoot. I've looked everywhere for that. He probably was pretty good. He'd been in the militia, and of course he was a hunter living out in the wilds of Kentucky, you know. Well, at the close of that exhibition, Colonel Berdan, being asked to illustrate the accuracy of his favorite rifle, fired 3 shots from different positions at a distance of 600 yards at a target. The target was a man-sized target, painted red, like a Zouave, you Civil War buffs there, you see. He hit that man-sized target at 600 yards 3 straight times. Then, having satisfied himself that he had the range down, he asked someone in the crowd to name a physical feature on the target that he should shoot at. And somebody hollered, "Right eye." Now this is 600 yards, 1,800 feet. And there's a little wind blowing. Verdun takes his time and walks out and toward the target, and finally he is ready. This crowd hushes, and bang, right through the right eye. 600 yards, my God. Verdun said later, quite honestly, there might have been a little luck involved. But still, if that wowed the crowd, during the encampment at Washington, some of Verdun's defects were becoming obvious. Instead of camping with his men, he moved with his wife into a comfortable large house nearby. Robert E. Lee and U.S. Grant always slept in tents with their men. And he had his men pitch tents on a hillside with the latrines placed above the tents. A lot of men started getting sick. I wonder why. The men of the regiment were disappointed when their weapons arrived, not Sharp's repeaters as promised, but breech-loading Colts. The men had no faith in the weapon, but were assured by Verdun that Sharps were being manufactured and were on the way. As the camp of instruction progressed, it became obvious that Verdun's plan for his men to operate from behind the front lines and pick off rebel officers at long distance would not work. Civil War weapons produced too much smoke. The long-distance targets just simply couldn't be seen because of the clouds of battle. So the sharpshooters' primary role was changed to that of pickets. They would operate in front of the main battle lines. They would form thin lines out there, and the lines would be so long and the men so thinly spaced that they were taught to respond to bugle calls. And that's the way they communicated. The sharpshooters, as I said, spent a sickly winter in camp at Washington. Come spring, the 1st Regiment was attached to the division of General Fitzjohn Porter in George Brinton McClellan's Army of the Potomac. It went south with its 1 Vermont company in late March, landing at Fort Monroe on the Virginia Peninsula. Thus began the famous Peninsula Campaign, and the 100,000-man army eventually would come within 6 miles of Richmond. Some of the first fighting occurred around Yorktown, the old Revolutionary War scene. Now the Sharps rifles arrived with telescopic sights. The sharpshooters now, 100-man company, fighting in the early fighting at Yorktown, while the Confederates were drug in for miles in trenches, cleared 2,000 yards of trenches of all rebels because they were hitting so many soldiers. Good shots. And it was said, there's a legend that goes with the Vermonters, that there was a cannon about 700 yards away that was plastering them with shells. And there was a bank, an earthwork in front of the cannon, and what the Vermonters did was to fire at that bank and kick dirt into the muzzle of the cannon until it exploded. That's an amazing feat if it's true. And then one day there was a skirmish with the Confederates back and forth across a river. And a New Hampshire soldier got in a duel with a Confederate. And the New Hampshire soldier got hit in the head by the rebel. Of course, they had sharpshooters too, not as well organized. Edward Ripley jumped out from cover grabbed the dead man's rifle, jumped behind a house as a bullet hit the corner of the house, just missed it. Ripley stood behind the corner and ducked out and fired. The same time the Confederate fired, and the Confederate was dead, and the shot missed Ripley by this much, just hitting the corner of the building. Ripley was some shot. I might add here that Winslow Homer was on the Peninsula Campaign as an artist for a New York paper. And his first oil painting that he did at the front was called The Sharpshooter. And I have a print from that painting right over there on that glass case called The Sharpshooter. That's from an 1862 New York paper. Years later, Homer recalled that seeing sharpshooters in the tree struck him as being as near murder as anything I could think of in connection with the Army. Say it right up front now. The sharpshooters were not popular with their fellow soldiers. They didn't think it was fair. You were never safe. You went from the front lines, back a half a mile even, to take a break. You still weren't safe from the sharpshooters on both sides. So the sharpshooters were not popular. The soldiers thought they should have been outlawed. Of course, they never were. The Peninsula Campaign was slowly moving on Richmond as Confederates under Joseph Johnston gave ground. The first big battle occurred 10 miles from Richmond, and Johnston was wounded. And Robert E. Lee took command. Johnston quite honestly said the shot that hit him was the best shot ever fired in the war. It brought Lee to the front. Thus began a week of solid fighting, the 7 days started by Lee. During those 7 days of fighting, Hiram Berdan began disappearing. He would be near the front lines, and then he would say something like, "I'd better go make sure that ammo's coming." And he'd disappear. Or he would say something like, "I'd better make sure the reinforcements are on the way." And he would leave. More and more, Ripley was in command. The last battle was at Malvern Hill. The Union Army had been driven toward the James River. They took position on a long, open, low ridge called Malvern Hill with a big field in front of it, and the Confederates attacked them. Then Ripley's sharpshooters were on the right flank, and a Confederate battery was brought into position to try to fire down the length of the Union line, the worst position, the best position you can get to fire at an enemy. And Ripley directed his men's fire at that Confederate battery and in 10 minutes virtually destroyed it. But as this was going on, Ripley was badly wounded in the leg. His leg was shattered. He could never walk right again, and he was out of the war. The 7 days, of course, was a major Union defeat. And it was a bad time for Berdan. He was twice accused of cowardice by fellow officers, but he was acquitted by 2 courts-martial. By the end of the Peninsula Campaign in the early summer of 1861, did I say 61, 62, the 100-man Company F was down to 40 men. But more trials were being held in Vermont, and those men were quickly replaced. Now we go back a bit in time here to meet Vermont's other 2 sharpshooter companies. Berdan also convinced Lincoln to form another sharpshooter regiment, the 2nd USS Sharpshooters. See, he wanted to be a general. Couldn't do that commanding one small unit. Berdan saw to it that this regiment had 2 companies of Vermonters. He knew how good they were. Companies E and H, 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters. The 10-company, 1,000-man regiment also had 2 companies of Pennsylvanians and 2 from New Hampshire. A tryout for the new companies had been held in the village park in Bethel by Homer Stoughton on October 11th, 1862. Captain Homer Stoughton from Randolph. 15 years later, Charles Fairbanks, who was too young to serve, remembered that he pleaded with his father for written permission to try out for the sharpshooters. His father reluctantly gave him permission, and 15-year-old Fairbanks went to the trial. He remembered, he said, I was fearful and trembling when I took my rifle in hand. There was a huge crowd of townspeople who seemed about evenly divided on my going to war on account of my age. But after making the first shot at the ring, there was a cheer from the spectators, for I had put a bullet nearly in the center of the bullseye, which was about 2 inches in diameter. In the middle of that 10-inch circle, it was a 2-inch circle. The remaining 9 shots were put inside the ring with a cheer from the crowd. Fairbanks qualified, and he was so excited that he ran through the White River to get to his father's farm to show him that he had qualified. He had a certificate. And his father took the certificate, looked at him, and wept. He didn't want his boy going off to war. But Fairbanks would go, and we're going to hear something quite important about him just a little later on. Unquestionably, the sharpshooting capital of Vermont was Randolph. That's where Homer Stoughton lived. And he had several friends, apparently, that he would had kind of a club there for sharpshooting. Company E, commanded by Homer Stoughton, gathered on the fairgrounds at Randolph. After 3 weeks of drill, it headed for Washington's camp of instruction on November 23rd, 1861. Company H gathered at Brattleboro the day before Christmas, 1861, and left the same day for Washington. Its drilling would come at Camp of Instructions, where it joined the rest of the 2nd Sharpshooter Regiment, including, of course, Company E. All 3 sharpshooter companies were at the Camp of Instruction in the early months of 1862. Company F of the 1st Sharpshooters was the first to go to war, of course, in the Peninsula Campaign. E and H went weeks later to the front, sent off to the west, part of the army under General Pope that would fight Robert E. Lee at 2nd Manassas. And Lee won a heavy victory at 2nd Manassas, although the Vermont Sharpshooters performed extremely well. And there's a marker today at 2nd Manassas where they were positioned in front of the railroad cut, if any of you have been there. When the battle ended, the 2 companies, once totaling 200 men, were down to 20 men each. But they quickly got replacements from Vermont. Based on the big victory at Bull Run, Lee invaded the North in a campaign that would end in the war's bloodiest single day of fighting. Of course, that would be Antietam. All 3 Vermont companies were Antietam, though in different major military units. Companies E and H of the 2nd Regiment played a major role in capturing Turner's Gap, which allowed the Army to get to Antietam. And when they got to Antietam, they fought in that infamous cornfield, the bloodiest part of the battlefield, the early morning fighting. And there's a monument to them there. The 2nd Regiment was also at Antietam. The Company F, big moment, came 2 days after the battle when they captured some Confederate cannon along the Potomac River as Lee was retreating. Now the sharpshooter regiments are made one unit under one command. They'll still be moved around from major command to major command, but they will now be together under one command, and that will be Berdan. He will lead them. In the spring of 1863, all the sharpshooters fought at Chancellorsville, capturing a Georgia regiment of more than 300 men. But Chancellorsville was, of course, a rebel victory. Based on it, Lee decided to invade the North again. So to 1863. In early June, Lee took his army west, over the Blue Ridge and into the Shenandoah Valley. Then he turned north all the way to southern Pennsylvania. On June 24th, Homer Stoughton was made a lieutenant colonel, in effect commanding the 2nd Regiment. Berdan was still in overall command, though he had survived another court-martial based on cowardice. Lee's army and the Army of the Potomac, now under George Gordon Meade, collided on July 1st, 1863, around the southern Pennsylvania college town where 9 roads come together, called Gettysburg. That day began the bloodiest battle of the entire war, and perhaps the most important. The fighting commenced on the early morning of July 1st with only about 2,000 Union soldiers on the battlefield, cavalry under the command of John Buford. Advancing from the west were 10,000 infantry under General A.P. Hill. At the rear of that column rode General Robert E. Lee. Well, Gettysburg. In southern Pennsylvania, 9 roads come together in a college town of about 2,000 people. It's also, of course, a farming community. West from Gettysburg runs the Chambersburg Pike. Just out here, half a mile outside Gettysburg, were Buford's 2,000 cavalry. They knew that Confederates in large numbers were camped out here to the west around Cashtown. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. Buford's advance pickets see Confederates advancing. A Confederate sergeant named Rupert Jones, who came from over on the Vermont border around Rupert, fires the first shot at the Confederates, the first shot of the Battle of Gettysburg, fired by a native Vermonter. The Confederates come on. Too many of them. Buford is having trouble holding. By 9:30, he's about ready to give way and retreat, and just in the nick of time, reinforcements arrive. Coming up the Emmitsburg Road, the 1st Corps under General John Reynolds, and they add men to Buford's line and extend it. And then in a couple hours, the 11th Corps under Oliver Otis Howard extends the Union line to the north of Gettysburg. But now Lee is bringing thousands in, and Baldy Ewell is coming down from the north, and the Union soldiers are badly outnumbered. Oliver Otis Howard, by the way, has an interesting Vermont history. He lived the last 15 years of his life in Burlington. He was head of the Freedmen's Bureau, by the way, a noble thing. He founded Howard University in Washington, and I had the privilege of knowing his granddaughters. Does anybody remember Susan Webb? She and her husband Kenneth founded farm and wilderness camps over on the Bridgewater Reservoir. And Susan was head of the Coolidge Foundation for a time, and I got to know her. Very wonderful people. But she had pictures of she and her twin sister in the general's lap. It was wonderful. So anyway, Howard, as he comes through Gettysburg, and he asks a kid to take him up to the top of the tallest building, and from there he sees these hills over here, hill here, and then a long ridge running south. And he has some of his men go up on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge and begin preparing earthworks, because it appears to Howard he may have to retreat. And by the end of the first day at Gettysburg, yes, the whole Union Army has to retreat up to the high ground, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge, all the way down toward two prominent hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Robert E. Lee did not want to fight at Gettysburg. But when he came on the field at about 9:30 to 10 o'clock in the morning and saw that his men were driving the Union, he decided to make a battle of it. And he won the first day, no question about it. He had driven the Union back, captured Gettysburg, captured the road junction, but he had driven them onto a very good defensive position. Troops are arriving all the time. Lee will have 73,000 at Gettysburg, and Meade will have 90,000. What a battle! My God! I mean, this is the big one. Well, the first day at Gettysburg ends. 18,000 casualties, a Confederate victory. Well, I don't give this talk very much. That's why I have to have this heavy use of notes that I don't like to do. It might have something to do with the fact that I've passed 80 by some margin. Anyway, don't you laugh, Judy. Well, the second day, the fateful day, really. So we'll do it from a different perspective. Up here are the two hills, Culp's and Cemetery. Town's over here. And then Cemetery Ridge goes south. Toward the southern end of the Union line is the 3rd Corps of Union soldiers, commanded by a man named Daniel Sickles. Sickles had no military experience before the Civil War. He was a very effective politician. He had so much clout, he got himself a generalship. Never should have had one. He became famous when on the sidewalk outside of the Capitol, he shot his wife's lover, who happened to be the son of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Talk about a high-profile shooting. But Sickles gets off. He is acquitted. The first acquittal in American legal history based on insanity. He was a good lawyer. Okay, this is Cemetery Ridge. Over here is Seminary Ridge. Seminary Ridge, that's the Confederate position. It's a mile between them. Down the middle of the valley comes the Emmitsburg Road, main thoroughfare. Sickles, 3rd Corps, has a positional problem. Cemetery Ridge is considerably higher than the Emmitsburg Road until it gets to where Sickles' 10,000 men were. And then the ridge drops down so that it is actually lower than the Emmitsburg Road. And Sickles could see this, a very serious, well-deserved concern, and he sends a message to General Meade back here in his headquarters here. He says, I want to move my corps up to the Emmitsburg Road because if they bring in cannon here, they're going to blast me. I won't be able to hold the line. Meade says, no, stay where you are. And Meade finally rides out and has a look at the situation. He said, no, you stay where you are. Well, about 10:30 in the morning, he summons Berdan. And Berdan is told to go out in front and get a look at what is out there. Well, Berdan takes 300 men out to the Emmetsburg Road, including 90 men from the Vermont F sharpshooters. 90 Vermont sharpshooters out here. Berdan reaches the Emmetsburg Road, turns south, and stops. Now we know there's Confederates over in this area, and he stops for about 15 minutes. Why in hell he did that, I have no idea. But by the time he started moving again, every Confederate over here knew that he was out on the prowl. So he comes down the Emmetsburg a little further. He goes west and into a wooded area called Pitzer's Woods. And in that woods, he runs into 1,500 Confederates. And he's got 300 men, they've got 1,500, and there's a vicious battle that lasts about 20 minutes. Berdan loses 20 men, but he kills 100 Confederates. But he comes out of the woods on the run and comes back to Sickles and says, whoa, they are everywhere. Now, what he had run into was the southern end of Lee's line, the fishhook line that, you know, comes all the way down here and ends in Pitzer's Woods. That's what he'd run into. So, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, without anybody's permission, Sickles aligns his 10,000 men, flags flying, bugles blowing, and marches them out to the Emmetsburg Road. And now there is a great bump in the Union line, which in military terms is called a salient. It is one of the worst things you can have in a defensive line. Winfield Scott Hancock, whose 2nd Corps was up in this area, watches this colorful advance, turns to one of his captains and says, and laughs and says, ha ha, you watch, they'll come tumbling back. Wow. So now we have got 10,000 Union soldiers way out in front of the line running straight until it gets here. And the Sickles, the famous Sickles salient, and historians to this day are debating whether it was a good idea. This cases can be made on both sides. Well, let's go to the southern end of the battlefield. Big Round Top, 300 feet above the valley floor. Little Round Top, 150 feet. And then the Cemetery Ridge goes north, and now you have the bump. And here's the Emmetsburg Road. Down here, there's a farm lane that comes in. And there's a farmer named Slider. House is right about here. Has a couple kids. There's a ridge that runs, low ridge that runs about like this, called Warfield Ridge. Not very high, 30, 40 feet high maybe. And there's some trees that grow along here. Kind of screens Warfield Ridge from the Slider farm. In early morning, Robert E. Lee had called James Longstreet to Lee's headquarters on the northern end of the battlefield and told him to take 18,000 men and march all the way to the southern end of the Union line and attack from the south. Longstreet did not want to do it. He didn't think it was a good idea, but he obeyed orders, and it took him a long time to get all the way. It was a 6-mile march anyway, but there was a low row of hills here that he tried to cross up in here, and when he got to the top of this low row of hills, he looks over at Little Round Top and sees Union signalmen and he can't cross here because it would give away what he was doing, so he had to turn around and go back and keep going south, and he had 2,000 soldiers already on that hill. It was a tough turnaround. But he finally, about 3:30, gets down into this area. 18,000 soldiers. In this area right here are 7,000 soldiers under John Bell Hood, the Texan, a fighting general. Any of you ever read Mary Boykin Chestnut's book on living in Richmond during the Civil War? You want to read it. It's a diary she kept. She was close friends with Jefferson Davis and his wife and so on. And she carefully charted John Bell's Hood attempts to win a hand of the most beautiful girl in Richmond, Buck Preston. That was a nickname. He never succeeds, and it's not helped by the fact that he loses an arm and then he loses a leg. Loses the limb at Gettysburg. So, 7,000 of Hood's men here, but the Confederate line extends here in the woods. 18,000 Confederate soldiers with orders to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. Longstreet gets down here, he looks up the Emmitsburg Road, and he said, "Oh my God, the road is blocked. It's blocked by sickles." He's supposed to be back there along his line. Longstreet looks out in front of him and he says, he asks permission for Lee. Now, a rider's got to go, 2.5 miles north to tell Lee anything. And he says, "I want permission to go around a big round top and come in behind the Union position." That seemed like the sensible thing to do. Attacking directly against these steep hills is going to be a stinker. Lee sends back a message, "Follow your orders." John Bell Hood says, "This is insanity to attack up that road. We're going to be fired on from the side. God knows what's up there." He sends an appeal and gets turned down. So the plan will go ahead, what is called an en-echelon attack. The attacks will start at the southern end of the line and then go one after another against the Union lines. Well, it's getting toward 4 o'clock. Homer Stoughton, Randolph. About 3 o'clock, gets the order. Here's the Emmitsburg Road. Here's the Slider Farm Lane. Big round top, little round top. Here's the Slider Farm Lane. Slider House. Stoughton gets ordered to take 200 men and go down and defend the Slider Lane. Now they have some interesting fences here. There's a stone fence that goes along this lane like this. And when you get to the farm itself, there's a fence that's shaped like this. 200 men, at least 60 to 90 of them Vermonters. Stoughton puts his Vermonters at the point, right here, Vermont, in the most dangerous positions. He puts men along here. So he's got men here, 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 and then there's a wall behind them if he needs it. Now, the Confederates do some talking among themselves. The first attack will be launched from this area. Here's Hood's division right here, 7,000 men. The first attacks will be launched by a brigade under Evander Law that includes 2 Alabama regiments. under command of a Colonel Oates. Stoughton decides to send 15 men out. Remember, there's some woods in here. Woods in this area. 15 men out to see what's in his front. When he had arrived by the Slider house, some of his men had seen a little scene on the Slider porch. A Slider boy came running out of the woods and down to the farmhouse. His mother was sitting out on the front porch rocking. And he ran up to her and he said, "Mommy, Mommy, there's Confederates out there in the woods." And his mother said, "Oh, don't worry about it, son. The Union soldiers marched right through there the other day. Nothing to worry about." Well, so 15 men, including our young Fairbanks, who competed in the trial at Bethel, remember, and then ran across the river to tell his father. He's one of these 15 men, and they go uphill on the Emmitsburg Road, break through the screen of woods, and right in front of them are 7,000 men. 15 against 7,000, Hall of Hood's division. Oh my God. 3 of the sharpshooters, including Fairbanks, are captured immediately. The rest of them run like hell and get back here to Stoughton. The captives, the 3 captives, are taken in front of Brigadier General Evander Law, right in this area. And Law questions them, finds out that they're sharpshooters, and decides, well, if they are sharpshooters, the way the Union operates, they're skirmishers. So there has to be a big army behind them. We'd better be careful. Well, so those guys are captured, and they'll be kept, and a couple of them will survive Andersonville. Evander Law with 2 Evander Law allows 2 Alabama regiments to break Lee's orders and not attack up the Emmitsburg Road, but to attack straight ahead to try to clear the sharpshooters and what Union soldiers may be on the hills. Because if the rest of the army is going to be attacking this way, they don't want fire coming in, flank fire coming in from the side. So, Law sends a heavy line of skirmishers through this woods, and down they come. Down this slope they come, and they are absolutely riddled by sharpshooter fire. And they go running back into the woods. A second line is formed. They come out of the woods, down the hill, and they are murdered again. A Vermonter goes out to check on a Confederate who's lying out there in front, bleeding, and the Confederate looks up at him and say, "My God, we never saw any shooting like that in all our lives." Good God, it's quite a compliment. Absolutely. Well, now that's enough. John Bell Hood rises up all 7,000 of his men, and the cheer, Stoughton said the cheer was even deafening back where they were. Here come, mostly Texans, here they come. And they're going to start attacking north. But these 2 regiments under Oates are going to come this way. And they do. And they come with some reinforcements, and they come a-running down this hill, and Stoughton's men are cutting them down. Shelby Foote said there was a brutal toll taken on those men, a brutal toll. But eventually they get to this wall and this wall, jump over the wall ready to bayonet the sharpshooters, and nobody there. They go on to, now they're taking fire from behind this wall. They go on, jump the wall, nobody there. The sharpshooters are falling back, particularly Minnesota sharpshooters going up on Big Round Top. The Vermonters going over this way in the area of Little Round Top. This sharpshooter, these 200 men spread out like this. And they're in the trees. And all the time that these regiments are coming across the field, they're taking more and more casualties. They can't see the sharpshooters. Finally, Oates' men get to the top of Big Round Top. They have marched 30 miles this day to get to the battlefield, and then that circular march, and then this. They get to the top, fighting their way all the way to the top. They have to rest for about 15 minutes, and then Oates, with his 2 regiments of Alabamians, goes down the hill because he's seen, this is all, Big Round Top's all trees. You can't put artillery up there. But below MEC's Little Round Top, bare crested, all rocky, you can put all the artillery up there you want. And he's going down and capture that because he saw that there was nobody on that hill, no Union soldiers except the signal team. But what's been happening when all this is going on? Meade sends Brigadier General Gouverneur Warren down to check on the southern defenses. He goes up on Little Round Top. There's nobody there but a bunch of signalers. Oh my God, says Warren. He rides back down, gets the first troops he can find, a full brigade that includes the 20th Maine Regiment. And they go back up on Little Round Top, form a line of battle. And at the end of it is the famous 20th Maine Regiment, about to become famous. Down Little Round Top, a Big Round Top, comes Oates, lines his men up and attacks, and is driven back by the 20th Maine and some Pennsylvania soldiers in this area. He attacks again and is driven back. He knows that if he can get that hilltop, he could win the battle. Then now comes the third big attack, but just before it happens, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, commander of the 20th Men, gets messages from throughout his command. We're out of ammunition. So just as the Confederate attack begins, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain orders a bayonet attack. And down the hill they come, hand-to-hand fighting, and the Confederates are driven away, and Little Round Top is held. It becomes the subject of the movie Gettysburg. It is now the most heavily visited spot on the battlefield. And it was a great, great Union victory, saving Little Round Top. The Vermont sharpshooters were all involved on this, taking sometimes long-range shots at the Alabamians. So the second day at Gettysburg ends with the Union holding off the Confederates. Robert E. Lee, of course, that night meets with his commanders. He's now lost another 30,000 nearly men. Here is the fishhook line. Lee says, well, I attacked the northern end, no luck. I attacked the southern end yesterday, no luck. They have to be weak in the center. And the next afternoon at 3 o'clock, he sends 12,500 men across the famous valley, led by a division of Virginians under George Pickett. Pickett's charge, and of course, as that charge reaches the Union position, 2 regiments of Vermonters swing out and smash the flank and deliver the death blow to Pickett's charge, the 2nd Vermont Brigade. I wrote a book about that. Gettysburg is a great Union victory. Well, the war goes on. The sharpshooters continue to play a major role. They play a major role, the Vermont sharpshooters, a major role in the Overland Campaign, at Wilderness, at Spotsylvania. One Vermonter puts a foot-long stick into his sights and knocks a Confederate out of a tree at 1,500 yards. They are at Cold Harbor, firing long range into the rear lines of the Confederates. And then they're in the long siege at Petersburg. The sharpshooter numbers are shrinking. It's getting harder to get replacements. And so finally, in January of 1865, the sharpshooters are disbanded and the Vermonters are made part of the 4th Vermont Regiment and will serve in the 4th until the end of the war. And they hate it. They hate it. At the end of the war, when the totals are added up, 620 Vermonters had served as sharpshooters. By far the largest per capita total of any northern state, and almost the largest total period, exceeded by New York. 620 men served. 117 of them died. Total casualties, 250. That's an astronomical, it's over 40%. It's an astronomical total. It's a great mark on this state's Civil War record, the sacrifice that was made. But that is not the end of our story. There's a little more to add here. In 1888, Colonel Oates, who had led the attack on the Vermonters at the Round Tops and then against the 20th Maine, attended a reunion on the battlefield at Gettysburg. And who does he meet but Homer Stoughton? And they get along beautifully. They have dinner together, they have a wonderful chat. And when Stoughton gets home, he has a letter from Oates, Colonel Oates. The great service which you and your command did was, first, in changing my direction and in drawing my regiment in the 47th Alabama away from the point of attack. You drew off and delayed this force of over 1,000 men from falling on the Union left, Little Round Top. And but for the service on your part, I am confident that we would have swept away the Union line and captured Little Round Top, which would have won the battle for us. You and your command deserve a monument for turning the tide in favor of the Union cause. And listen to this. 7 years later, Oates writes to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, commander of the 20th Maine, now governor of Maine. This is what he said. If Colonel Stoughton had not been where he was to lead me off up that mountain and had not gone right up the southern rugged face and right up over the top of it, I would have found the Union left an hour earlier than I did, and I would have taken Little Round Top, which would have terminated the Battle of Gettysburg. Holy shit. That's all I can say. If the Confederates had Little Round Top, no Union commander has ever said that the Cemetery Ridge line could have been held. Was it the Vermont sharpshooters, the majority of the Vermonters, commanded by a Vermonter at the Slider Farm and then in the retreat, that saved Little Round Top on the second day, saved it so that the 20th Maine could get there? Suddenly, Vermont's record at Gettysburg becomes far more interesting and probably far more important. There's one final bit of information I want you to have. Back there when Hood, who was horribly wounded in this battle, when Hood was looking at the situation and his lieutenants were looking at it and say, there's no sense, it's crazy to follow his orders and go north up there. And Longstreet can't get the orders changed. What do they want to do? They want to come around Big Round Top and attack from the rear. Not a bad idea. I don't think any of them knew of the fact that from this area, the Emmitsburg Road, through the gap between the Round Tops, there was a road, a good road. It's still there. And camped along this road, they had arrived late the first night, was a unit of some 2,500 soldiers who had dug in and were facing south just in case something sneaky like that might have been tried. It was Vermonters. It was the great Vermont Brigade, the 1st Vermont Brigade that virtually now every major historian, including James McPherson, says was the best brigade in the Union Army. It would have been no picnic, even with Hood and 7,000, to try to get by those boys. So, certainly, I think it can be said now that Vermont did more, per capita, maybe not even that, to win the Battle of Gettysburg with the defeat of Pickett's charge, and now this incredible new evidence that they slowed the attack on Round Top, because most of the Vermonters who did that never knew in their lifetimes the importance of what they did. Their reports just say, we fought to delay them and then we moved on. Now, with these oath letters that have come, I think we've got a whole new story at Gettysburg. Thanks for listening. By the way, I brought a couple of things. I brought, over there is Winslow Homer's sharpshooter, but right in front of them there are some sharpshooter glasses that belong to a Vermonter. Part of the original paint is still on them. Those were given to wear on bright days to cut down the glare. And if those were Vermonters, we know that from Lamoille County. I don't know who, but almost certainly those glasses would have almost had to have been at Gettysburg. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Third day, the sharpshooters with Vermonters got around on Confederate Avenue. They were just trying to figure out where the Confederates were, because we put a monument there with the eagle on top.
That's second day stuff.
Second day, pardon me.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's second day stuff. Yeah, there's a monument to the Vermonters in the woods over there.
Yeah.
And there's one at the Slider Farm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another one. It's a small one. No, I think you're right. I think it's the two. Yes.
That was just basically to figure out where the Confederates were and what they were doing.
Yes, that was why Bernard led them into the woods there, Of course, Sickles was scared by what Bernard told him, that, that woods was full, but he knew nothing about the 18,000 soldiers. Still, that begs the question of his being out there in a way blocked that retreat, but caused some vicious fighting, the wheat field, the peach orchard, it was just awful. It caused the deaths of an awful lot of soldiers. It's a tough one to argue. I'm not sure. He was in a tough position down there, and he got his leg blown off during the whole thing. I really don't know.
Which you went to visit at the Smithsonian.
Yes, and he used to visit it regularly.
Yeah. He was a little Dane.
He had an ego. Yes, I think we can say that. Those sharpshooter positions are well marked, and now Round Top has been closed.
Yeah.
Round Top, the whole top of the hill has been rebuilt, new trails put in and everything, but just opened up. It's been open about a month now, and I'm hearing various reports on it. Some say they put too much cement in. I don't know, but I hope to get down and have a look. Yes, Jack. Jack and I worked together at the Rutland Herald.
Yeah. So I know that Longstreet became quite a critic of Robert E. Lee. Was it based on that denial going around the southern end, or was it something else?
That had a great deal. That had a great deal to do with it. Had a great deal to do with it, and Longstreet was very critical of Lee's decision to fight at Sharpsburg, at Antietam. Lee only had about 38,000 men when the battle began, and McClellan had most of his 80,000 there. And the odds were very long to stay with the river at your back in the north side of the Potomac. Lee sort of got away with it, but he took huge, huge casualties. And he gave, of course, Lincoln enough of a victory to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which changed the whole war in the Union's favor. Longstreet was unquestionably Lee's favorite general, but he didn't like to argue with people, and most of Longstreet's arguments were very rational. The only thing that maybe you can say a lot about Longstreet, he's a little slow. He's a little slow getting on the move. He's a little slow at Second Manassas. He's a little slow at Gettysburg, and he's a little slow at the Wilderness, but he gets there. He gets there. But I think if they had gone around behind those mountains, those hills, it would have been an entirely different battle. My God, it wouldn't look anything like. And I'm a great fan of the Vermont Brigade, but 2,500 men weren't going to hold off maybe as many as 18,000 for all that long, but they would have slowed things down. Yeah, I don't know. It's a fascinating battle, and I always have to fight my mindset at Gettysburg, because you have to remember when you're there that all these things were happening instantly. They'd never been to this place before. They didn't know the terrain. They didn't know the roads. They didn't know. And they had no helicopters. So you have to get into that mindset, and that I've walked that territory where they drove the sharpshooters by the flight farm, and it's all rocks and boulders and swamps, and a brook runs through it. It's very, very hard to get across. But I want to go once more. Because I keep finding out more and more about this. Yes?
I'm curious about Vermonters' weaponry at this time, the ordinary farm boy, because they're using rifles here. And I'm wondering, how common was it for them to have rifles at this time as opposed to a smoothbore musket? Was that typical to have rifles?
I think it was. I mean, there were a lot of muskets laying around the farms from, the Revolution, from the War of 1812. But I think a lot of the farms by then had actual rifles, and you had to, of course, have those to try out for the sharpshooter. You couldn't shoot with that accuracy with a smoothbore. So I think they had them. When I was a kid in Woodstock, my grandfather had a little farm in South Pomfret. I spent a lot of time I loved that man and his wife. And every year there was a hunt supper at the Grange Hall in South Pomfret. What happened was that 100 men from South Pomfret divided into two teams the week before and had a day-long hunt for squirrels. And the team that got the fewest squirrels had to do the hunt supper, had to cook the food. Well, of course, their wives did it. But I remember being at my grandfather's farm one Saturday afternoon on the day of the hunt, and my Uncle Alan drove in, and he got out of his truck, and he had two big paper bags, and he dropped them down on the lawn, and they were both crammed, bags like this, with dead squirrels. I mean, it's a wonder there are any squirrels left. And apparently these hunts were fairly common in Vermont. I mean, Vermont was a hunting state. In some ways it still is, although the number that hunt deer is way down. But, you know, on a farm through the cold months, there isn't much else to do, is there? Vermonters could shoot, is what I'm saying. And yeah, I saw it that day. My God, those poor squirrels. Yeah. Anything else?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I went to the wilderness battlefield some years ago.
Yeah.
And I thought I would see new growth forests there, but it was all second growth, and it was just bushes and junk. And a lot of people were telling me both the smoke from the rifles and the kind of vegetation was down there, that a lot of the troops wound up firing on themselves.
Yes.
Because they couldn't see the flags and everything like that. So I'm trying to ask you two questions at once. And also Cedar Creek I've been to, but I can only see it from the road. I don't know, I think there was a reenactment there, and I was not a reenactment gear, so I felt a little funny about going to, and they had only a little tiny little thing for Cedar Creek. Apparently they've improved it in the 8 or 10 years since I've been
Yeah.
there. Again, the Vermonters led it. But how did they prevent being, in other words, were the rifles they used, was as much smoke coming out? Because I heard that so much smoke made the battlefield and it just made it hard to see your what would you call it, your friend, your Union partner there. You wind up shooting into somebody else. Did they avoid that, or did they wind up shooting?
They wound up shooting at noise and flashes and following, you know, the orders of their commanders who were pointing in the directions they would be firing. They couldn't see hardly anything. And that's why the soldiers know so little, and their letters are so, they talk about what me and my buddies were doing right around me, but they don't have anything mainly about strategy, you know. And why even those sharpshooters, you know, that probably prevented the taking of Little Round Top, they weren't seeing enough of the overall battle to know what they'd done. They went to their graves saying, you know, we fought to delay them, but they never put two and two together, you know.
How about the regular army, when they saw how many people were being shot by the sharpshooters that they didn't have to shoot at, and maybe they were a little safer? Did they ever get to like the sharpshooters
They hated
better?
them. They hated them.
Through the whole war.
Because they were never safe. They were never safe. You know, particularly at Cold Harbor. 11 days in trenches at Cold Harbor. And the trenches went 7 miles on both sides. And you'd be up front of the trenches, and then you had to crawl like 200 yards back to the main lines, and then you kept down through the larger trenches to go way back where, you know, you get some food and you could get washed up a little bit.
So
And
you're
men
talking
were
about
getting
the soldiers were never safe.
never safe. The men were getting shot a mile back from the front line. Sitting back there, not fighting. It really was, you know, a discouraging prospect. You know, you mentioned that growth at the wilderness. So the battlefield had been cut over about 10 years before the battle. And you know, things grow fast in Virginia. It was so bad that when Jackson's flank attack was made on the 3rd of May, April, God, 18,000 men coming through this second growth burrs and bushes, and about a third of them emerged from the woods naked. The briars just tore their clothes off.
I asked you one time.
I did a film once in the wilderness, and I found the thickest patch I could find, and I went in and I got stuck. I could not get out. And I'm a little claustrophobic. And so I started getting a little freaky. And it took the cameraman and the producer and a guy who just happened by to reach in and pull me. And when I came out, I was all blood. And I was getting toward naked. Ruined all my clothes, yeah.
I asked the guy, I said, do they know who won? And they said as best as they could figure, but you might know the statistics and whatever you know,
Yeah.
the best they could figure is it was a draw. And I said, does anybody really know? And he says, that's the best they can
Yeah.
figure.
Yeah.
Because of all the, you know, the,
Yeah.
what you had, the burrs and the
Yeah.
smoke and
Yeah, it was
draw.
an awful business, yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.